Hi, my name is Kai Li, and I am currently a lecturer in psychology at the University of Reading, Malaysia. In this presentation, I will discuss a piece of research I have conducted with two lovely colleagues, Yiling from the Royal Malaysia Police and Nail from Maastricht University and Universitas Indonesia. This project is titled Police's and Victim Care Officers' Beliefs about Memory and Investigative Interviewing with Children. Child protection professionals, typically police investigators, deal with many complex cases of alleged child abuse on a daily basis. In many cases, there is no corroborating evidence other than the child witness themselves, and therefore, the investigative outcomes rely heavily on the child's recollection. Now, we know that investigative interviews are not easy to conduct, but interviewing children can be considered an even more challenging task, given that research has shown children to be more susceptible to suggestive influence, and this can lead to memory errors. If investigative interviews are not conducted well, the affected children may be put through prolonged legal proceedings, only later to have their interviews testified by experts as inconclusive. Inaccurate information that is obtained through the interviews can also lead to false accusations. The worst scenario is that the abuser may run free, giving them a chance to exploit other children. Through many years of research, we now have a better understanding of children's cognitive development, particularly in memory. And this knowledge has shaped best practice recommendations for child investigative interviews. It is extremely important for interviewers to adhere to evidence-based protocol to prevent the negative consequences that I've just mentioned. While there are evidence-based guidelines, in reality, many practitioners still tend to rely on techniques that are based on pre-existing intuitive beliefs about memory functioning and investigative interviewing. And these beliefs may not necessarily be in line with current scientific research. In the current literature, many studies have been conducted in the western part of the world. For example, Melinda and colleagues surveyed judges, police detectives, mental health professionals, prosecutors, and defense lawyers in Norway, and found that defense lawyers were the least likely to believe children are credible and better witnesses than adults. In contrast, psychiatrists and police detectives were the most positive about children's capacities as credible witnesses. In the United States, Buck and colleagues found that jury-eligible students had poorer knowledge of child interviewing research compared with forensic interviewers, public defenders, and forensic psychologists. Only a couple of similar studies have been conducted in the East. Both studies found similar findings in that child protection professionals demonstrated knowledge of eyewitness memory that is less than optimal. So what are the implications of these research findings? Well, if children are seen to be less competent than adults in remembering incidents they have experienced, this perceived lack of credibility and reliability may lead to their testimony being given less weight in court. Erroneous beliefs may negatively impact the behavior of professionals and have a profound influence on the outcome of an investigation. For instance, an investigative interviewer who does not believe that memory can be influenced by suggestions may be less likely to take precautions with wording when interviewing a child. Also, psychological expert witnesses who are summoned to court to give an expert opinion may be basing their recommendations on personal beliefs as opposed to up-to-date scientific knowledge. So in our study, we examined beliefs about children's memory and child investigative interviewing practices among police officers and victim care officers in Malaysia. In Malaysia, police investigators who investigate child abuse cases serve the Royal Malaysia Police in a division known as D11 under the Criminal Investigation Department. A number of these investigating officers are trained to conduct interviews with children. There are also a group of victim care officers, some of which who are registered counselors, who work under the Criminal Investigation Department, supporting victims of abuse and their families. Now, in light of the data found in other parts of the world, we expected in our study that inaccurate beliefs about children's memory functioning would be prominent among these child protection professionals. We also expected that the interview practiced by police interviewers would not be in accordance with evidence-based protocols that are internationally endorsed. We administered a questionnaire study. There were two sections to this study. In section 1, 50 police officers and 23 victim care officers completed a 20-statement survey in order for us to assess beliefs and knowledge on memory functioning and child investigative interviewing. They indicated whether they thought the statements were true or false, or they could also select the don't know option. Section 2 has a case vignette in which a 7-year-old girl was allegedly abused sexually by her stepfather. This section was completed only by the police officer sample. The police were asked to prepare a list of questions related to the alleged abuse in order to know what happened. They were asked to write down the questions in order and to formulate the questions in a direct sentences format. In this slide, you can see a table that contains the 20 statements to assess knowledge on memory functioning and child investigative interviewing. All statements except for statement number 13 are false, according to broad scientific consensus. This table shows the percentage of professionals who provided answers that are in line with current memory research, in other words, correct answers. We ran an independent samples t-test, and there was no difference in overall performance between the police and victim care officer groups. Multiple regression analysis also revealed that age, length of service, as well as the number of interviews conducted by the police did not influence the performance of each group. We ran a Fisher's exact test to see if there were significant differences between the two groups in how they performed on each item. There were two items in which they differed significantly. Item number 3, it is impossible for a child to develop false memory of child sexual abuse. For this statement, more victim care officers made mistakes. For item number 6, the more confidence a person has when reporting a memory, the more likely it is that the memory is accurate. More victim care officers answered this correctly. Participants were also asked to indicate how good their understanding of child investigative interviews is, and how satisfied they are with the outcome of their work with children interviewed as alleged victims or witnesses. We ran a Mann-Whitney U-test and found that knowledge and satisfaction ratings for victim care officers were significantly higher than those of police officers. In Section 2, police officers were asked to list the questions they would ask an alleged child abuse victim. These questions were coded with reference to the NICHD manual on utterance types. Responses were first categorized into non-substantive and substantive utterances. The substantive utterances were then coded into 4 different question types. Invitations, for example, tell me everything that happened. Directives, these are mostly WH questions, for example, where did it happen? Option posing, these are like yes-no questions or forced choice questions, for example, did it hurt? And suggestive questions. Anything that implies a particular response is expected can be coded as suggestive. A question that contains material that was not disclosed at the beginning, so for example, who did something bad to you? Or if it sounds risky, do you understand what rape means, for example? These are also coded as suggestive. The first author, which is myself, and a research assistant, performed the coding independently, and we found a good inter-rater agreement with a Cohen's kappa of 0.75. Any disagreement that we had were resolved through discussions with the third author, which is Nail, and he is also trained in the use of NICHD protocol. To summarize the findings, as expected, child protection professionals who deal with child abuse cases did not fully endorse beliefs that are consistent with the up-to-date scientific literature. The majority of participants provided accurate responses to only 2 items out of the 20. They accurately believe that children's memories are more susceptible to suggestions than adults, and they also accurately believe that a witness may mention details of an event at a later time, and that does not necessarily indicate memory inaccuracy. So our findings show that the expertise of professionals working in the criminal justice system is not always evidence-informed. However, we also acknowledge that police practitioners have an extremely high workload, and also they are not forensic experts who are expected to engage in the current literature. Victim care officers in Malaysia typically have some background in psychology, but as generalists, they also cover a wide range of victim services within their job scope. This means that these practitioners simply do not have the capacity to engage in specialist training to enable them to be more competent in their jobs. However, we're pleased to see from Section 2 of the study that police officers had attempts to engage in positive interview practices. There was evidence of rapport building, and the proportion of suggestive type questions was also relatively low, even though ideally, interviewers would use more general invitations and open prompt questions. But a more concerning finding is the mention of props or visual aids, such as dolls and drawing in the planned interviews. Some studies have raised concerns about the use of dolls. It has been argued that dolls can lead to more suggestive and longer questions by the interviewer, but also less detailed responses from children. The general consensus among child interview experts at the moment is that props should be avoided. The key takeaway from our study is that knowledge and skills gap can be rectified through training, supervision, evaluation and feedback, as well as continuing education. That being said, a common issue around the world is that research-based knowledge does not always transfer to work in the field. According to Griffiths and Milne, several factors have to be in place in order to ensure that organizations apply the best evidence in policing in general. 2 factors are particularly relevant to the context in Malaysia. Leadership that encourages institutional culture or change towards evidence-based approaches, as well as being open-minded to effective techniques. With more awareness and continued training, and positive investigation outcomes as a result, we hope that this would motivate investigators to be more reflective upon their own methods. In conclusion, our findings from this study serve as a foundation for intervention and policy making in a country that is seeking to move forward. If you would like to know more about this study, here's a link for your reference. We would also like to say a big thank you to D11 of the Royal Malaysia Police for their support. Thank you for listening.